Before we dive in, I'd like you to take a moment and pretend with me. Imagine that you need to go to a really important training seminar for work. You go there, you get into a big building, a big room, it's pretty full. You have to sit near the back. You sit down, the speaker walks out. They're super excited, really energetic, and speaking a mile a minute. On top of that, the acoustics are horrible. You can't hear. You don't know what's going on. It's hard to keep up. You think to yourself, no worries, I'll rely on the slides. I'm sure they'll be perfect. I can follow along. They start posting the slides, and this is what you see. Unbelievable. You can't read them at all. What are you going to do? You have to get back to work next week, present all of this information to your core team, but you can't follow along. How many people at this point would maybe give it another hour or so? If it doesn't get better, get up, walk out, demand your money back. Or you could sit through it and just kind of wing it at work, hoping you grokked something, right? None of these are great options, especially given the time and money you spent here. In this scenario, you were unable to hear due to poor acoustics and fast talker. And you were unable to see because of the distance from the slides, as well as poor contrast on these slides. In this situation, you were impaired, and you were unable to perform the task at hand and actually learn this new information. And that's because this was an inaccessible experience. Unfortunately, experiences like this happen much too frequently for people that have permanent disabilities, such as those that are blind or are deaf or hard of hearing, people who have motor impairments or cognitive impairments. And inaccessible experiences like this can truly impact somebody's performance at work, their livelihood, and their entire lives. So that's why we really want to focus on creating more accessible and inclusive experiences. And what do we mean exactly by that? When we talk about accessibility, we really are focusing on ensuring that people with disabilities can perceive, understand, interact, and operate with tools and products and services and environments, and that they're able to equally contribute without any barriers. And accessibility is a really key component of being inclusive. To be fully inclusive, we're also considering other dimensions of human diversity, such as age and gender and ethnicity. So at this point, you might be thinking, okay, of course, I don't want to create these inaccessible experiences and impact somebody's life, of course. But where do I start? What can I do? And that's what we're here today to talk to you about. We wanted to share some tips on two areas of things you probably do on a daily basis. One is creating documents that anyone can access and read, and the other is having more inclusive meetings and presentations. So with that, Catherine's going to come up and dive into some details around creating more accessible documents.
Thanks, Jen. Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm an interaction designer on the Central Accessibility team at Google. So making sure that your products are accessible is one facet of being inclusive at work, but how you present and document your work to your coworkers or externally at a conference is an important way to include people of all abilities. Today, we'll be going through how to make your Google Docs and slides more understandable and more readable by people of all types of abilities and disabilities. We'll also be specifically focusing on how to make them more accessible to screen readers. For those who don't know, a screen reader is software that sits between you and the application. It works in tandem with the keyboard. Whenever the keyboard moves the focus, the screen reader will vocalize what has come into focus. For example, here on google.com, which you know of, we have this button. The focus is there, and the screen reader will vocalize Google search button. A lot of people who are blind or who have a learning disability rely on the screen reader. So it's really important to think about this assistive technology when designing our documents. In order to make inclusive docs and slides, you can improve the comprehension of your content, enhance the readability of your docs and slides, and provide efficient navigation for all types of users. Before even technically talking about how to make your docs accessible, we can think about how to improve the comprehension of our content for everyone. Let's start with something that you might be familiar with. If you ever watched a video in a loud sports bar or in a library with the volume turned down, you might have seen this text on screen. Some people call this captions or subtitles. Do you know what the difference is? So raise your hand if you hear the answer. What is the difference between captions and subtitles? Is it A, there is no difference, they're both transcripts or translations of the dialogue? Or is it B, closed captions include additional cues for things like music, sound effects, and other indications of sounds? Yes! Good one, 50% chance. So yes, subtitles are the transcripts and translations of the dialogue, while closed captions were specifically designed for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. So they include additional information about other types of sound indications, like music or sound effects. In your next presentation, try including closed captions for any audio or video recordings. On YouTube, you can actually look for automatic closed captioning by finding this icon next to the settings in the bottom right of your screen. Closed captions are not only beneficial for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, they're also great if you're learning English as your second language, if you're watching something in a noisy environment, or if you have a learning disability. So it's really great for everyone. If your documents have a link, try to make it as informative as possible. Let's look at this link here. It says, click here to learn how to make links informative. What's wrong with it? Well, we kind of know it's a link because it's blue, underlined, and bolded, so we know to click there. So that's verbose. And screen readers can actually scan for links, so verbose links just waste time. Instead, tutorial on how to make links informative is actually more succinct and more understandable for everyone. Color is a great way to convey meaning for your text, graphics, and other visual cues. But relying too heavily on color really excludes people who are colorblind or unable to see the screen well. We have these 3 radial progress bars, a green one, blue one, and red one. They make sense to someone with perfect color vision, but they might look like this if you're colorblind. You can actually try this out yourself by converting your image to grayscale and seeing if it still makes sense. So what we can do here is add labels and change the design to improve the comprehension of color-coded information. We actually added the percentage value so that no one has to guess it. And we thinned out the shaded area so that everyone can see quickly what the percentage is. Now that your document is easier to understand, you want to enhance its readability for all types of vision. Especially in terms of slide decks, use comfortable text size, please. I can imagine that it's easier to read the bigger font versus the smaller one, especially if you're far away in the back of the room. The goal here is to reduce eye strain so that the viewer can focus on your content quickly and then return their attention to you. So in making an important point, you would try to use a text size of at least 24. Here, comfortable is size 24. And this is beneficial for someone who has low vision or sitting in the back of the room. So actually, in your next presentation, go to the back of the room, sit there, and see if you can still read your slides. In terms of readability, it's also important to choose the right font. All capital letters and cursive fonts are not recommended because they're hard to read, especially if you have dyslexia or low vision. The viewer spend, probably I'm guessing you're doing this, too much time trying to read the text rather than paying attention to the speaker or their message. Instead, consider sans serif for titles and serif for the body of your content. They're both easier to read on screen when projected, and the viewer can quickly read the content and return their attention to you. Finally, color contrast is critical when thinking about how to better read your text on your documents. Color contrast is the difference in luminance and brightness of the brightest color to that of the darkest color. So that sounds like a lot of gibberish, so let's look at an example. Here, the color contrast is the difference in luminance and brightness of the light blue to the dark blue. And color contrast is expressed via a ratio. Here, the ratio is 1:1. It's pretty low, so it's kind of hard to see the difference between these two shades of blue. The higher the ratio, the better the contrast. This bright yellow in regards to the black is pretty easy to discern. The contrast ratio is 16.4:1. That's pretty high. The highest ratio is actually black text on white background. Here it's a ratio of 21:1. That's why, after all these advances in design and graphics and color theory, we still read our web pages and our books with black text on white backgrounds. It's the most legible experience. Ensuring good contrast is critical for improving the readability of your documents, as well as reducing eye strain. Here we have gray text on gray background. Some of you might be able to discern this text, but people with low vision or sitting in the back might not be able to. Instead, what you can do is choose a color farther apart on the color wheel from gray, such as this blue, to increase the color contrast. You can also lighten and darken shades. Here we kept the same gray background, but darkened the font color to increase color contrast. There are other ways to increase color contrast that aren't through color. For example, you can increase the font weight by boldening the font, or you can increase the font size. Ensuring good contrast will improve the readability and experience of your documents for everyone. Now that your content is easier to understand, your document easier to read, you want your work to be accessible to screen readers and other assistive technologies. This sounds pretty daunting, but don't worry. Docs and slides were specially designed to work well with these assistive technologies. So, using the built-in features that we'll be presenting next, you can help your users navigate your document very easily. Try using headings to section out your document. Headings provide structure and organization to your document. They also allow for keyboard shortcuts that screen readers can use to navigate to those headings. And the same power users that use these keyboard shortcuts might be yourselves. Headings also automatically populate the document outline. This is another great way to navigate your document, especially if it's really lengthy with a lot of pages. If you have any images in your slide deck or document, think about putting alternative text to that image. So screen readers read whatever's on the screen, but if no description of the image is given, then by default, it'll just read out loud, image, and that's not useful. Try to write a brief description and the alternative text to that image instead. Finally, most of us collaborate on our documents, so opt for the commenting and suggestion features rather than writing notes in the document text. These features allow screen reader users to navigate to those comments without hunting through your document text for them. In addition, document owners can receive email notifications and review comment threads, which can lead to a more productive collaboration. So that was a lot to learn about, so let's recap on how you can make more inclusive docs and slides. Keep your content simple and concise. Ensure good contrast and comfortable font sizes. And use the built-in features provided by docs and slides. Again, if this is too much, docs and slides work really well with assistive technologies, so they actually have templates that you can use yourselves that meet these guidelines. So don't worry about it. Now, Andrea will come up here to talk about how to have more inclusive meetings and presentations.
Thanks, Catherine. Can you hear? OK, good. So I'm Andrea. I'm an experienced user researcher on the accessibility team with Jen and Catherine. As Jen had mentioned earlier with the example, when your presentation is inclusive, but the way you present it isn't, that's a waste of time, right? You spent all that time, you have that great idea, but it all goes down the drain if your audience just misses the message. So how do you make your meetings more inclusive now that you have inclusive materials? First, let's go over some general good practices of having good meetings. 1, create psychological safety. Psychological safety, for those who don't know, is when you're in a group of people and you feel safe and have trust within the group to express your whole self. 2, practice good meeting habits. 3, ensure everyone's voice is heard. And 4, share decisions and feedback. So I'm sure this sounds really good to everyone, but the next question is, yeah, now what? How does this have to relate to accessibility? I'm going to go over a few tips with you. Before the meeting, being inclusive starts even before you step foot in a meeting place. So here are a few things to think about before you even have the meeting set up. 1, have you shared your content in advance? So this is helpful for people with visual and cognitive disabilities who may need more time to go through the content that you send out. But it's also really useful for those who may need more time to absorb the information, and also maybe someone who's new and just ramping up on the project. And just, for everyone to be on the same page that when you come into a meeting, you're ready to go. Secondly, is your video conferencing system accessible? Think about those who are blind or low vision who are trying to navigate, let's say, a touch screen, or the size and placement of the system for those with motor impairments. Can they reach them? Is it a good experience? Think about, is your table height suitable for people who are in wheelchairs? You don't want a table, those like brainstorming tables go up to here. Someone wheels up. They can't be part of the conversation anymore. Think about, is your furniture spaced out in a way that people who may be using wheelchairs, have guide animals, or a cane can easily navigate around the room? And also, if you are planning an interactive activity, can everyone join? Try to make sure everything that you're planning ahead of time is inclusive. And throughout the whole meeting, try and keep the background noise to lower levels so everyone can be heard. All right, now that you're set up for your meeting, let's go into 8 don'ts and do's to keep in mind during the meeting. So number 1, don't speak all at once during group meetings. For those who are blind or hard of hearing or deaf or low vision, they may rely on lip reading or an interpreter. And when everyone's speaking all at once, they're not sure who's talking anymore. So do speak one at a time. This makes sure that we're all on the same page and that everyone's voice is heard. I'm sure this is something that you probably wish for in meetings with or without anyone with disabilities. And this is especially true when someone's on a conference call. 2, don't say things singling out people with disabilities like, let's speak one at a time for the sign language interpreter. This implies that the deaf person and the interpreter are actually slowing down the entire meeting and you're calling them out. So instead say, hey, let's speak one at a time so we can all follow the conversation. This practice of not singling anyone out for whichever case is actually really useful. Let's say you may have someone who's not as fluent in the working language. They can follow along as well. 3, don't say, please interrupt me if I go too fast at presentations. While this is great that you're taking into account how difficult when you're speaking too fast it can be for people who are reading your lips, or sign language interpreters, or non-native speakers. The problem with saying this is that it puts the onus on the attendees to speak up. And they may be thinking, oh, you know what? Actually, I don't want to speak up, because if I speak up, then I'm the person with the disability who spoke up, slowing down the entire meeting. I'm not going to do that. So they just sit there and not understand. So instead, articulate more slowly, but don't exaggerate, as it can distort lips. Facial expressions and gestures can help here as well. Basically, speaking at a moderate pace is really helpful when people are also, writing down notes, or they're momentarily distracted. They can still go along with what you're saying. 4, don't communicate only by gesture or cited information. So, for example, don't say the person in the blue shirt, or that graph on the left. For someone who is blind, low vision, or have color blindness, or deaf and hard of hearing, when things are said that way, they have no idea what you're referring to, and again, puts the onus on them to speak up. This actually happens when you also have someone who is maybe they're sitting out of line of sight of the screen, so they actually have no idea what you're talking about, or they're again writing down notes, or they're dialing from another location. When you're referring to something that uses cited cues, not everyone can be a part of it. So instead, use other types of contextual cues. Instead of saying that person in the blue shirt, say Jen from Google, who mentioned earlier that she loves clouds. Or, instead of the graph on the left, you can say the graph on active daily users for this past quarter. That gives everyone the context to continue, even if they're looking at notes and just writing. 5, don't apologize to the sign language interpreter if you spoke too fast. You're not talking to the interpreter. You're talking to the person who is deaf or hard of hearing, whom the interpreter is assisting. So if that happens, just redirect your comments back to the deaf person, and then make yourself and the content available for follow-up. 6, don't be too embarrassed to ask someone with an impairment to slow down, to speak up, or to repeat what they're saying if you don't fully understand. I have a colleague who she's in a wheelchair. She has a partial hearing loss and a speech impediment. And she likes to tell me, the first time I was too embarrassed to ask her, she said, you know what? Yeah, if you don't speak up and you tell me that you don't understand me, that actually kind of hurts me and my work and wastes, all of our time. So please speak up. I'll repeat it 3 times, 4 times. I don't care. I just want to make sure we really all leave with the same thing here, that we all came in for the right reason. So definitely please speak up. And then mention which part you found confusing, and then ask for clarification. Again, this is useful for everyone. Some point in time, somebody mumbles. That happens. Or somebody speaks too fast. That's often me. Or, there may be an accent you're not familiar with. Either way, the goal is to have a productive meeting. And you can't do that if you don't understand each other. 7, so, sometimes towards the end of a meeting, you have a lot of slides to cover, and you just don't have enough time to cover the rest of your slides. So you may say something like, okay, I'm almost out of time. It's only a few more slides. I will go through this really quickly. Don't do that. It's less effective for listeners of all abilities to grasp information, but it also, again, puts the onus on the attendees to speak up when it doesn't work well. And let's be honest, how often does that happen? You're already rushing against time. So for interpreters especially, that means that they can't physically interpret as fast as you talk. They're just physically impossible. So they'll pop into what they call outline mode, and they're basically just having to try and figure out how to outline what you're saying as you're saying it, which means the deaf person gets less information. So what you do is focus on summarizing your last points, not talking faster. 8. Okay, sometimes when you're in a meeting, people may, turn their bodies, talk to someone else, make a side comment, make a joke, or even towards the end of the meeting, you guys may naturally get up and start having side conversations and have a quick joke or a comment. When that happens and someone with a disability, if they couldn't hear you or understand what you're saying or couldn't read your lips, and they ask you what's going on, don't ever tell them, never mind, or I'll tell you later, or it wasn't important, even if it wasn't important. Because when this happens, it makes people feel that they're being alienated and they're not as important of a member of your team. So if you do that, even if it's a side comment, even if it's a really terrible joke, try to include everyone as much as possible in all aspects so that you make sure you're all one team and they're all listening to the same thing and being part of something together. Again, that was a lot of don'ts and do's. I know 8 is beyond what people can usually remember in one go. So let's go over the key points for more inclusive meetings. So first, speak clearly, at a moderate pace, and one at a time. Use verbal, visual, and other contextual cues when communicating. And lastly, don't single out people with disabilities as a reason why you're doing something a certain way. Remember, oftentimes, if not almost every time, it benefits everyone. So now, Jen's going to come back up and wrap up with some resources.
Thank you. All right, so now you all have some new tools for your toolkit, hopefully, that you can go and apply next time you go into work and have some meetings or need to create some documentations or presentations. One of the great things is that we're learning, and probably you've noticed, is that a lot of these things that we covered today, obviously we're initially focusing on people with disabilities, but it also improves the experience for people without disabilities. So it benefits everybody. And when we focus on being inclusive for people with disabilities, like I said, it benefits everyone. And with that, you can actually ensure that your work is better understood by everybody. And with doing that, you can actually ensure that feedback is easier received and provided. And building on top of that, that kind of makes everything a bit more productive. And so everybody's productivity is increased. So to make this even easier to remember all of these things that we've been talking about today, the great thing is that one of our apps, it's called the Google Primer app, they actually have a lesson on accessibility. The Google Primer app is a really great app that has these bite-sized, jargon-free types of lessons for people that are just really rushed and don't have a lot of time. They have lessons that focus on many different topics, but we really wanted to highlight this accessibility one because, again, it's something you can use and take away and refer to. The other thing and reason we wanted to highlight this is because while the team that built this lesson, while they were building it, they actually applied a lot of these principles to their own application. And so this is a great little case study we wanted to share with you of how even at Google and elsewhere, people are applying this beyond documents and presentations, but to applications and tools. So just a few things to highlight. The Primer team, they modified their color scheme to ensure that there's better contrast. So you can see this pretty clearly between the old and the new. It's much easier to read, even on these slides. They also used iconography in order to better kind of group the different lessons and identify themes throughout the lesson. So it's just easier to comprehend. And they also focused on more efficient navigation. They added alt text, like Catherine talked about before, to any of the images within the application. They also used more standardized patterns that people were familiar with. So on the new version, they have this very basic checklist, which might not be very sexy, but it's very, very efficient to use, and people understood that, versus some of the newer UIs that people were trying out. And they also ensured that there were multiple ways to interact with and navigate the app. So they introduced some navigation, additional ways to navigate at the bottom. These are just a few highlights of the things that they did and how they applied these lessons that we just talked about to their own app. So you can find this You can find the Google Primer app at this location. Like I said, it has the actual lesson, which is great, but then you can also just by looking at the app and navigating and experiencing it, you can understand some key principles around creating accessible applications. And also we wanted to highlight that a lot of the content that Catherine covered can be found in our Google Docs Help Center. And if you just search for an article called Make Your Document Accessible. And before we leave, I wanted to leave you with one additional thought. And that is that we fully understand, I think we're all in the same boat. Again, none of us are maliciously out there trying to create these inaccessible experiences. That's a given. That said, we do all have the power and responsibility to intentionally work to be inclusive so that we don't unintentionally exclude people. Thank you for your time.